We just want to have some information about your personal background, but kind of intellectual background and history and how you got involved with the analysis.
For sure. I began my working career as a school teacher. I was a teacher originally of English. I'd done a degree in English literature, very strongly in the Leversite tradition, which is what all literature teaching is, or was at that time in Australia. I became interested in the mass media and the teaching of such as a way of getting an edge in my teaching rather than simply reworking existing literary texts. And I went on a series of courses that were run by my colleague Barry McMahon. That stimulated sufficient interest that I then went and did further postgraduate study in the area of media studies. I then worked for a number of years as what we call a consultant in media studies, which means you tour around the state advising other teachers on how to teach the area. After doing that for 4 years, I then left and went into the higher education area, and I'm now a lecturer in media studies.
Media stories in Australia, it's been established now for how many years, and what does it look like?
In Western Australia, it's been established in schools now for 15, 16 years, to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, it hasn't been uniform in all schools, something happening, but overall about that amount of time. It's also established in schools in all of the other states, every state of Australia, although not for such a long time as in Western Australia. What does it look like? It's changed over the years. It began with a much stronger hands-on practical bent. It was seen that the way in to teaching kids about the media was to let them produce their own materials, then analyse their own works. That's changed a bit. There's been a lot of forces changing that. One of the simplest forces was economics. As more and more students took up media studies, you couldn't have a camera or a reporter pack for all the students. Another force changing that was a pedagogical one. There was a worry that much or some of the hands-on activity really didn't lead a long way. It was a good creative experience for the students. They enjoyed it. The atmosphere was nice, but where was that hard critical edge about what they were doing? So that was a force for change as well. Increased education of the teachers changed that. When we began, teachers were given their conceptual framework in media studies really as a short package. They'd spend 5 to 10 days with Barry and I in what was called an in-service course, and we tried to cover the whole lot in that time. That has largely changed. People are doing either their undergraduate courses in media studies or postgraduate work in media studies. In my own state, teachers can be trained quite specifically as media studies teachers.
In terms of the pedagogical paradigms that are out there in Australia, what are the dominant ones, and can you shed some light as to why these particular models came to the top?
I can only speak within my own state and within the areas of communications, the arts. Within the teaching of language, that is English, English literature, language studies, reader response theory is probably the dominant paradigm and has been now for 5 to 8 years. It's rejected largely within media studies. Do you know what I mean by reader response?
No, maybe you should.
Reader response, I'll give you a very negative view of it. Reader response is the sort of thing that says, what do you think of this? And whatever you think of that is just as valid as what the next kid thinks about it. It rejects the notion that meaning lies in the text. It accepts the notion that you as a competent reader are free to make up your own meanings. It's best summed up in the terms begin where the kids are at.
So it's a highly subjectivist approach to it.
That's right, highly personalised approach, very subjective. Depends very much upon the creativity of the student and bringing forward the creative response to the work. My personal objection to reader response theory is that you can begin where the kids are at, but you often don't get very much past that. And English teaching has suffered badly in my own state for that reason. So within media studies, we have tried to actually identify a body of knowledge which needs to be worked upon with students. So there has been, and that's come under criticism, this idea that you teach some things and you don't teach others. There's always choices must be made when you write a curriculum. But we have taken the line that there is a body of knowledge, there are a set of skills, there are a set of concepts, and that we want to get those across in a sequential manner from K, reception, I don't know what you call it here, but the very first grade, up until the final grade of schooling.
When you begin to do the kind of analysis that would encourage the student to look at ideology and power, how early does that take place in the educational system in media studies, for example?
Dealing with the question. It is, of course, a laying open of yourself. I mean, classrooms must be the most institutional power relations. You can look around and see visually how they're set up. The teacher's at the front, the kids aren't. The teacher's often on a podium, the kids are below. They're put into lines. The teacher has freedom of movement, the kids don't. The teacher has freedom of speech, the kids don't. So once you start opening up any text to analysis in terms of power relations, the classroom is an essential text and will be read by the students as such after a while. So all forms of cultural analysis, which is all that is if you look at your own classroom, because it does empower, is also a threat to those who hold the power in the status quo. So yes, I mean, teachers have to be prepared to take on that threat, I suppose.
All right. The other question is, this question I'll ask Barry later on, but it's, why should Australia, along with Scotland, be the leaders in media studies and media education? Do you have any speculation about that?
Part of it, I think, is the system promotes it. That we have in Australia, each state has a highly centralised education system. Now that doesn't account for why it started there, but it does mean that if someone had the bright idea, it is quite possible to have that bright idea implemented very quickly and to saturation level, because it's a highly centralised system. Unlike Canada or the United States or England, whereby you have local education authorities or local school boards, each of whom must be convinced to take on media studies in the curriculum. Whereas at home, really, and that was Barry's task in the early years, was to convince one single authority that it was worth doing. Once you've achieved that, then it's in straight across the board. And Scotland's the same. They have a central education authority, which I think allows the opportunity for more efficient implementation. Why those places? I don't know. In my own state, it began by Barry McMahon, his own personal interests, which he then followed up. He went overseas and studied very deliberately to come home and start media education, which he did. It really related back to one person in the beginning. It doesn't any longer. I mean, I would suggest the risk of hurting his feelings, he is now irrelevant to it. It is part of the curriculum that will go on apart from him.
In Australia, you've been fortunate to track with some of the best sort of intellectuals that deal with cultural studies.
Yes, we have been very lucky, and my home state has been particularly lucky. We're lucky because the English like a place in the sun, so coming to Australia is a guaranteed place in the sun. So into my own state have come John Hartley, whose work you might be familiar with from reading television, and John Fiske spent a number of years there. And John Fiske was highly influential at the time he was there. He participated in a series of workshops that was done with teachers, and John Fiske is a very fine teacher, a very, very good teacher. And he was able to take some of the more difficult conceptual material and translate it into accessible packages for teachers. Now, John didn't pretend to be able to teach kids, but what he could give was something to teachers which they could then take one step further and turn into strategies for the classroom. And Fiske had a very fine influence in that way. He also made it legitimate for people to work with popular texts. Here was someone who was published, who was respected in his area, he was a senior lecturer at a university there, and he is dealing with Madonna, video games, shopping malls, swimming pools, beaches, barbecues, the full bit. And so he legitimised the study of popular culture. Not for everyone, there's lots of people there who think it's an absolute waste of time, but it was a start.
Yeah, the other question is, sort of, if you could cast your glance to Canada and make some kind of prediction of what's going on in terms of media literacy. It's been implemented in Ontario, and it it's located in English departments here. And some people are not sure that that's a good thing, because essentially it means that you have a territory and all the English teachers are able to do the analysis. Well, I don't want to put you on the spot, but can you comment anything about media literacy in Canada and the structure that it's evolving?
I've been most impressed with the level of the debate that I've found in Ontario in terms of media studies. It seems to have got much higher far more quickly than it did at home. The teachers that I've spoken to are well educated in the area, and to their credit, most of that seems to be self-education and the work of the AML in their own workshops. What I think needs to happen here to ensure the place of media literacy and the continuation of it is that you must get some form of media education into your teacher training institutions. There must be a way for teachers to say, or students to say, I want to teach media studies when I come out and I want formal training in that. Until you get that, then it's always going to be ad hoc and depending upon someone's interest in the school and what to do when someone leaves that school. Whereas if you've actually got teacher trainees coming out and graduating with that area of expertise, then I think it will ensure its survival. Its place in the English studies program, I have mixed feelings about it. At home, that's largely the case as well. It hasn't always been. At first I was against it, and we actually had teachers who taught solely media studies, and that was fine, and they were outside of English departments, but they became quite isolated and marginalised because there were often only one or two of them. They weren't part of the mainstream of the staff in the staff room and didn't have the same access as larger departments to school resources. As part of an English department, those problems are overcome. Against it, of course, you often have an ongoing struggle within a department between certain critical approaches that are seen to be either valid or invalid by members of the department.